We begin today's ledger with a classic case of sunk cost fallacy playing out at the highest levels of the executive branch. The current administration finds itself staring at a sovereign balance sheet dripping in red ink, tied to a military venture that was aggressively marketed to the American taxpayer as a tidy 6-week restructuring operation. We are now significantly past the close of that fiscal quarter, and the promised dividends are entirely absent. The stated objective was the complete liquidation of Tehran's nuclear acquisition capabilities. Yet, a cursory audit of the ground truth reveals nearly 1,000 pounds of highly enriched uranium sitting securely in subterranean vaults, wholly undisturbed. Meanwhile, the adversary has utilized this extended ceasefire to efficiently reallocate their capital into rebuilding and reviving their ballistic missile portfolio. The executive is effectively cornered, forced to choose between two equally insolvent propositions, neither of which offers an acceptable return on investment. When the president addressed the public from the South Lawn today, he engaged in a rather spectacular display of rhetorical accounting. When pressed on his proximity to resuming kinetic operations, he claimed that the military apparatus was fully capitalized and ready to deploy. He stated that the naval assets were loaded to their absolute margins, prepared to initiate hostilities before he single-handedly halted the transaction a mere 60 minutes before the market opened. Let us strip away the public relations and look at the structural reality of that timeline. There are glaring discrepancies regarding the factual accuracy of this narrative. Internal disclosures from the executive branch suggest this sudden pivot had less to do with unilateral mercy and far more to do with urgent distress calls from Gulf stakeholders. These regional partners simply did the arithmetic. They realized that any American offensive would result in immediate, severe Iranian tax collection on their own domestic infrastructure, much like the aggressive overhead costs we witnessed at the onset of this conflict. Furthermore, there are significant logistical doubts regarding the ability to project necessary force if the conflict were to be fully rebooted. The administration has now issued a revised timeline, extending a 2 to 3 day grace period for Tehran to submit a compliant nuclear arrangement that Washington can securely sign off on. To assume that a 72-hour window is sufficient to renegotiate a decade of geopolitical gridlock is a mathematical absurdity. It is the equivalent of expecting a local baker to resolve a municipal bankruptcy over a long weekend. There is absolutely zero structural evidence to suggest this limited time frame will yield a finalized contract. The regional board of directors is clearly anxious about these volatile profit margins. Egypt's foreign ministry has been notably vocal regarding its role as a regional mediator in these stalled negotiations. In recent diplomatic exchanges, Cairo has officially commended the executive's decision to delay military action, framing it as a prudent investment in de-escalation and extended dialogue. They are pushing heavily to maintain the current operational stability, insisting that the diplomatic machinery is moving forward, albeit at a glacial pace. But if we examine the competing term sheets, the gridlock is deeply systemic. The primary friction point, predictably, remains the nuclear portfolio. Tehran's latest counterproposal reads like a ransom note formatted as an invoice. They demand the legally binding retention of their uranium enrichment infrastructure under the guise of domestic energy utility. Furthermore, they are billing for a complete cessation of all financial sanctions, the immediate unfreezing of seized global liquidity, the termination of the naval blockade, and direct compensation for structural damages sustained during the war across all fronts, including their subsidiaries in Lebanon. Conversely, the American position is entirely singular. The primary executive demand is absolute assurance of zero nuclear acquisition. Behind closed doors, the Defense Department had been circulating a portfolio of targeted strike options to the administration. Up until recently, the executive was steadily moving toward authorization, driven by a profound operational frustration with Tehran's stonewalling tactics. However, the diplomatic credit line remains open, a decision reportedly finalized only after separate, intensive consultations with major shareholders in Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. We have, of course, reviewed this exact ledger entry before. The established pattern involves optimistic back-channel signaling, often brokered through Pakistani intermediaries, suggesting the Iranians are prepared to settle. The executive project's imminent success, only for the entire arrangement to default hours later when the Washington analysts finally review the fine print of the Iranian counteroffer. It is difficult to identify any structural changes in the current dynamic. Tehran treats its enrichment enterprise as a non-negotiable core asset, which strictly violates the administration's stated red lines. The influence of the Gulf states in this boardroom drama cannot be overstated. Their capital heavily sways executive strategy in the Middle East. For now, the administration continues to prioritize a negotiated settlement over further expenditure. The defining metric is simply a matter of patience. At what point does the cost of waiting exceed the projected cost of military escalation? The primary directive for this administration is to find a swift, low-cost resolution. Prolonged military operations are viewed as an expensive, necessary evil, but for the moment, they are willing to let the clock run and gauge if a financially viable compromise can be reached. If we analyze the broader geopolitics of the Gulf, these nations are walking an incredibly narrow fiscal tightrope. While they have suffered direct overhead from Iranian proxies, there is a prevailing market understanding that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates must eventually negotiate their own long-term leases with Iran. It is crucial to note that these regional partners are not operating as a consolidated entity. They have adopted distinctly different risk profiles. Saudi Arabia is heavily invested in a de-escalatory posture. They are actively hedging against conflict and, leveraging their deep institutional ties with Pakistan, are attempting to broker a diplomatic off-ramp. The United Arab Emirates operates on a completely different fiscal model. They are aggressively doubling down on their security investments with the United States and Israel. They have chosen to act as the tip of the spear, signaling a willingness to forcefully liquidate Iranian regional influence. Despite this divergence, the executive's recent public communications indicate a desperate search for a pretext to avoid further kinetic spending. The reality is that there are no attractive military options currently available that offer a positive return. Time is a depreciating asset for the administration. With domestic elections approaching, economic anxieties naturally transition into voter behavior, meaning a prolonged, costly engagement is a severe liability. Ultimately, none of the regional stakeholders want a frozen conflict with zero contractual resolution. The consensus across the region is that the administration is seeking a highly localized, narrow deal. They want an agreement that strictly reopens the shipping straits and applies a temporary freeze on the nuclear portfolio. The administration proposed a 20-year hold. The Iranians rejected it, but a narrow deal is the objective. This approach, however, deliberately ignores the massive structural deficits plaguing the region. It leaves the ballistic missile threat unaddressed. It ignores the drone fleets menacing Gulf airspace and targeting vital energy infrastructure. It completely sidesteps Tehran's continued funding of regional subsidiaries like Hezbollah and various proxy militias in Iraq. The underlying assumption is that these local liabilities will be left for the Gulf states to balance on their own ledgers down the line. Egypt and the broader regional syndicate are effectively attempting to structure a diplomatic bailout package under severe time constraints. The prevailing consensus is that time is a rapidly depreciating asset. Tehran is intentionally dragging out the arbitration process, attempting to extract maximum concessions while the American executive feels the structural heat of domestic economic indicators manifesting in election year polling. We are rapidly approaching a hard deadline where the executive must either commit capital to a military venture or officially write down the losses. There is a distinct calculus coming out of Abu Dhabi regarding this delay. The Emirati perspective relies on the assumption that a financially starved and structurally weakened Iranian state will eventually be forced to the negotiating table on highly unfavorable terms. The fundamental question, however, is whether the Iranian asset has been sufficiently devalued. Is the downside risk of military escalation, the inevitable retaliatory strikes against Gulf energy infrastructure and desalination plants, worth the theoretical payoff? Abu Dhabi's assessment appears to be that Tehran has not yet reached true insolvency, evidenced by their continued willingness to stonewall negotiations. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard, operating essentially as the enforcement arm of this enterprise, has issued explicit forward guidance. Any American kinetic audit will result in immediate, severe market volatility across the entire region, not just localized skirmishes. In response to this, the American executive casually noted on the tarmac that the Israeli Prime Minister was perfectly comfortable with the deferred military action, insisting that Jerusalem will not authorize a hostile takeover without Washington's express approval. Despite the president's public insistence that he faces no margin calls and is in no hurry to close this deal, the domestic ledger tells a vastly different story. Rising energy costs at the pump operate as a highly visible, regressive tax on the American electorate, and the prolonged, ambiguous nature of this standoff is proving increasingly unprofitable in public opinion metrics. The executive is attempting to market the situation as a completed transaction, claiming his primary objectives have already been realized. Yet the structural reality remains unaltered. The nuclear infrastructure is intact, and the ballistic missile supply chain is actively being optimized. To truly understand this gridlock, one must examine the fundamentally opposing business models at play. The Gulf states have constructed their entire economic foundation on foreign direct investment, stability, and acting as global logistical hubs. You simply cannot maintain a trillion-dollar portfolio in finance and technology when your airspace is congested with incoming munitions. Their model requires a stable operating environment. The Islamic Republic, conversely, operates a model where structural suffering is branded as institutional pride. Conflict is their core competency. If you review the geographic footprint of Iranian influence, it is essentially a portfolio of distressed assets and failing states: Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen. A resumption of active hostilities leverages Tehran's competitive advantages while directly threatening the fragile profit margins of their Gulf neighbors. What we are witnessing in the Strait of Hormuz is a strategy of mutual economic strangulation. The American blockade is systematically starving the Iranian economy, costing them roughly $450 million a day in lost export revenue. Add to that an $80 million daily deficit incurred by their own internal internet suppression designed to prevent shareholder dissent. Inflation is running at 70% and their currency has collapsed. However, unlike a private corporation, a sovereign state can perpetually print fiat currency and rely on a strict monopoly of violence to maintain operational control. This is not an enterprise that will file for bankruptcy by the end of the quarter. This internal decay is sustainable for months, if not longer. For the American executive, the domestic economic fallout has, thus far, been a manageable line item. It is a slow, grinding test of economic endurance. Historically, Tehran's corporate strategy is to project absolute defiance right up until the moment they abruptly announce a willingness to restructure their debt. The immediate wildcard remains the off-balance sheet liabilities, namely, the Iranian proxy militias operating out of Iraq. Recent intelligence confirms that drone strikes targeting Emirati nuclear infrastructure were launched by these subsidiaries. Thus far, neither Washington nor Jerusalem has chosen to aggressively liquidate these specific assets, but if the overhead costs for the Gulf continue to rise, retaliatory audits are inevitable. Finally, we must briefly address the leaked reports suggesting an early American and Israeli operational goal was a forced change in management, specifically aimed at installing former executive Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. The narrative claims an errant strike on his compound derailed this speculative corporate restructuring. In a geopolitical environment oversaturated with weaponized misinformation, one must apply an incredibly heavy discount rate to such spectacular claims. I rarely take these speculative operational leaks at face value. If you find value in stripping away the political marketing to examine the actual balance sheets governing our world, I suggest you subscribe to the ledger here. We will continue to audit the absurdity as it unfolds.